So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. Tonight, I am delighted to have Gary Graham, the creator and manager of Bloom, with us this evening. So, Gary, thank you so much for joining us.
Delighted, Sarah. It was nice listening to that little bit of intro music and seeing all those images of the vineyards and Casa Real. I've had the privilege of visiting those amazing places. So it was lovely to have those memories.
Absolutely. It's such a beautiful footage. It really does it. I think it puts the longing on us to travel, but that's where we are. And I do think that...
and for a glass of wine, Sarah.
And a glass of wine, and that one I can do very happily. I think the audio of that video has become my soundtrack for 2020. But to those of you joining us this evening, if anyone has questions for Gary over the course of the evening, please do type them in and we will happily make our way through them. But Gary, just to kind of set us off and kind of set us up for this evening, obviously today is day one of our kind of second iteration of lockdown here in Ireland. And when you and I were talking earlier this week, you were telling me about a little bit of the research that Mental Health Ireland has done into the value and the kind of the benefit of gardening. And I wonder if you might just kind of run through that for us to set the scene.
Yeah, I guess it's obviously with the evenings closing in and we're heading into darkness. It's not quite the same as the first lockdown, but I guess what we discovered back in March, I guess what more people discovered back in March, something that many others like myself and people who've been involved in horticulture all their life know, and we know this innately, but what many other people discovered were the benefits of being outside in their own space, in their garden, and the benefits that are physical, mental, and maybe even spiritual, if you can actually feel that connection to nature and something bigger and greater than yourself. I suppose I thought of was the number of times I've heard quotes this year that I haven't heard for many years of people talking. There's always some nice clever quote. The one that I heard so many times this year was the old Audrey Hepburn quote, to plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow. I guess this year more than any other year that has been so apt, because we need something to believe in. We need to know that this is going to pass and times will get better and so on. So whether it's the guys who got into vegetable growing early in the year, there's a lot more of them who have got into that space, and particularly younger families and younger individuals who previously would have thought, well, gardening is something for the old crusty guys, and it's not something we're not going to get into. But that has become really important to a lot of younger people growing fruit and veg in particular. But then even moving through the year, then like in recent weeks, I'm talking about, well, what should we be doing now? And obviously you can get your bulbs into the ground for next spring. And again, there's that sort of commitment to the future. And that's exactly the sort of thing that we need to be doing. I think what you and I, Sarah, were talking about in terms of Mental Health Ireland, when you look at what they recommend and what you need to do on a day-to-day basis, and they talk about 5 or 6 different areas. And when you look at them all, you could kind of tick the box with them. If you looked at gardening, you could nearly tick all of those boxes, and that includes things like connecting, being part of something, being active, being physically active, taking notice of what's going on around you. And of course, we're all much more aware of mindfulness and meditation these days. And learning something new, and there's always so much to learn about the garden and learn about nature, and giving something back. And again, you do often feel, if you're out there and you're making a space, even if it's only more aesthetically pleasing, even if you haven't thought about nature and biodiversity, it might be something that the neighbours get to benefit from and get to admire. So yeah, I think never more than this year have we all realised that gardening has so much benefits on so many different levels. And we have seen, I don't want to get into all stats and figures and so on, but we have seen something like a 265,000 increase in the number of households who've got involved in gardening in this, and that can only be good for all of us and for the planet and for biodiversity.
Absolutely, I think we'll be better off in the long run. I know a lot of my own ambitions in the garden this past couple of months has been undoing the damage that a young dog has been doing, digging everything in sight. But Gary, I guess I'd love you to bring us kind of back to the start in your own life in terms of your own interests in horticulture, because I know that is actually your own background. Like, where did your own interests come from, and how did that journey go?
Back to helping my grandfather, I guess, in our long corporation garden in Bluebell, Dublin. And then he had allotments, or plots as we called them back then, along the canal. And that was as a teenager. And of course, back then it was like, really, do I have to do this? This is so boring. Really, and I never would have thought of it as a career. But then I think around the leaving cert age, when I had made a complete mess of the leaving cert and was struggling to figure out what to do next, I ended up working in Caulfield's gardening shop on Dame Street, which was one of those old style gardening shops. Some of your listeners and viewers might remember them, but it was the old. It's not like the modern garden centre, which is very much a department store. Back then, you had the men in the brown coats, and it was all very serious. And you had young guys like me running around mixing up bags of dried blood and bone meal and whatever kind of formula or formation that people wanted for their fertilizers. But back then, I guess that's when I discovered the whole world of plants and horticulture and the Latin nomenclature, which just intrigued me. I remember a poster on the back of a door of a Convallaria majalis, which is a lily of the valley. And just being intrigued by that and drawn into it, and realizing actually, there could be a career. And then went off to the Botanic Gardens in Glasnevin, which was an amazing opportunity, where you get to work half your day in the gardens with all these fantastic experts and this amazing national plant collection, and then you've a half day in the classroom, and then you get paid at the end of the week, so you go and have some points as well. So and indeed give some money back to your mum or whoever. So that was really, I suppose, my start in horticulture. Then went off to Chicago and did an internship in Chicago Botanic Gardens, and I've been landscaping and I've been in retail, and then of course, finding my way back into college and into business and marketing and so on. And then somehow ended up them combining them all together to end up in this sort of role I'm in now.
Okay, and you touched on there, so you obviously spent a period of time training in the Botanic Gardens here in Dublin. Was it part of that you found yourself going to Chicago? Was this kind of an overseas placement type thing?
It was, yeah, it was exactly. Yeah, it was an internship. It was, I guess it was the late, well, we were mid 80s, was it 85, 86? Things weren't great around. Yet another recession. They seemed to come on a regular basis. It was one of those recessions, Sarah. People were heading for London. They were heading for New York. A lot of people were thinking about how they could make as much money as possible in other countries. And I saw this opportunity to go and do this internship and to be steeped, I guess, in American horticulture and indeed in American culture. And of course, at that age, again, it was a fantastic opportunity for me. And coming from my background, to end up working in, one of the most successful, wealthiest neighborhoods, and their gardens, the Botanic Gardens, is a huge operation, and it is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the States. So yeah, it was fascinating on every level, and I guess I got to see, with a horticultural lens, and I got to see the breadth of work that's possible that I wouldn't have seen back in Dublin in those days where things were very tight.
That is a question I'd be very curious about. So obviously through the Botanic Gardens, we've got our national collection here in Ireland. Like, what does the Irish National Collection look like in contrast to, say, that of Chicago, be it in scale, but also in the types of plants and materials that we actually are growing in our different climates and environments?
Temperate rainforest, to use the technical term. Obviously, there's a big maritime influence there, but it means that we can grow one of the widest ranges of plants possible. Not necessarily on a commercial scale in terms of, we're never going to be growing a huge number of grapes. I think Santa Rita is safe enough, and we're never going to be getting into, all of that kind of stuff, or tropical fruits and so on. But we can keep plants alive, and we have this possibility of growing a huge range, particularly with protection and the sort of glass houses that we have in places like Glasnevin, where we have the curvilinear range and the Turner palm house and so on. And so we're very, very lucky. And it's an old plant collection, so anything over 100 years in the States obviously is old, is ancient to them. So Everything is very new there. Obviously, they have, or certainly back then, they had money, they had resources, they could move things around, they could do things on a scale that. And I suppose back in Glasnevin in those days, as I said, it wasn't good times economically, so you couldn't be throwing lots of money at a botanical garden or a plant range, but things got better then, thankfully. And then of course they had Bertie Ahern in the neighbourhood as well, who was a big fan of the Botanic Gardens, and his father was a gardener. So our own national collection then was improved, and there was investments made, and the gardens were upgraded. And I don't know if you've been there any time recently, but the plant collection, the facilities, I know we're back into lockdown now, but in terms of the restaurant, the whole experience is probably 100 times better back than when it was in those days, when it was a very kind of a basic sort of operation.
And it's interesting. It's kind of, you're saying that obviously we were just coming out of recession times in Dublin, and you then find yourself thrown across the pond in Chicago, in a very affluent area, and dealing with a very different kind of selection of people. I remember us having a conversation at one point where you spoke about this whole idea that there was this big juxtaposition of, say, the people you'd meet who were doing the work within the gardens versus, say, is it the docent program? Am I remembering that?
Yeah, the docents. Yeah, it's which is a term I had never heard before. It, I guess, from your work in curation and museums and so on, where they're volunteers, very, very committed volunteers who are a really important part of the workforce. And there were huge numbers of those in the gardens in Chicago, and they were all very wealthy people who just didn't need to work, but had an interest and passion in plants and wanted to keep busy. I guess it was part of their social life as well. And managing people like that again is very different, obviously, than managing a paid workforce. So you have that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the grunts, if you like, the physical labor, the really kind of hard physical labor, that was all conducted mostly by Mexicans. Which again is common across all of North America, I guess. And it's no different, I guess, anywhere in the world where people will move to where there's pay, there's work, and so on. Obviously not so easy these days in Trump's America, but we won't go there. So yeah, it was for me, that was really, particularly at a cultural level, to get to meet so many people for such extreme walks of life and backgrounds and beliefs and views. So and then the program they had for the internships in Chicago was great, because you got to live with families, So for a while I was living with an ultra orthodox Jewish family, where I was burying cutlery and stuff in the garden if I was mixing up my dairy with my meats, And it was all very, very strange and new, but I think a great way to open your eyes, particularly for a young man or woman, I think. And I'd say this to my own kids, many young people, that opportunity to go away and see how things are done elsewhere, and to get a different perspective. I think it's powerful. So I was very lucky that I had horticulture that allowed me to do that. And of course, over the years, then we're working on bloom and different things. I've also had that opportunity to go and visit other gardens, other shows, and so on. And when you can do that, and you can spend some time with the people, not as a tourist, getting behind the scenes, I think that's when you really kind of start to learn about people and life. Not to mention the plants.
Yeah, no, but I think culture is such a big part of it. And I think the more we can do to meet people from environments that are not like our own, and just broaden our minds and broaden our world. And I guess when we're talking about travel, coming back to the kind of the Irish context, just in terms of how kind of our culture of gardening and horticulture has evolved and developed in Ireland. I remember you telling me that a number of Dutch horticulturists come to Ireland in the 1970s, and that's an important moment in the kind of the wider story.
I think so. In a previous life, I spent almost 10 years working in the horticulture industry, and working with all areas of the production base, if you like, in horticulture. So the ornamentals, the plants, the Christmas trees, all of that kind of stuff, but also the fruit, the veg, apples, everything, which again was a great experience. But what I guess what I noticed at that time was, and I hadn't ever really thought about it, was that, you know, up until then, I guess we hadn't had, there were a couple of nurseries that were sort of noted nurseries that were involved in, you know, daffodil production or rose. Very, very few, but we didn't really have the sort of tradition, particularly that they'd have across the water in the UK, in horticulture and gardening. Gardening was something that was very much owned by the aristocracy, the landed gentry, and we just didn't have it going on. And I guess we didn't have the industrialization, and we didn't have that where people then, you know, were growing their own fruit and veg and indeed their cut flowers and so on in the garden. Nothing, you know, like to the same extent as across the water. So things have been very different. Horticulture, I would say, is still very new in this country, particularly ornamental horticulture and garden design and so on. Other than outside in the big houses, fine, but they were very much copies, you know, mimicking what was happening across the water on the mainland, as some of those people might have said, or further afield. So yeah, so I think there are a couple of things that happened, and the arrival of the Dutch was definitely one of them. And they came into nursery stock, plants, fruit, veg, cut flowers, and every so often you come across these names. You know, the Rentes in my valley, one of our biggest nurseries, the Schrams, the Trasses, the Von Engelbrechtens, they pop up again and again. The Doles, Mount Congreve Gardens, not far from me here, is one of our most famous gardens. And again, it wasn't just Ambrose Congreve's money and ambition that made it happen. He had access to some amazing experts, again, who were Dutch. So the influence, it's not seen, it's not recognized, but I think it's huge. And again, on that point, like, we don't, because it's still so new, we don't have that history. We don't have many. We have a handful of second generation businesses. Now, someone now will come on and say, no, Gary, you're wrong. There's a few others that are third generation. I'm not aware of them top of my head. There's a few second generation, but we don't have businesses that have been around for hundreds of years, that have that tradition, have built up the knowledge, the management teams, the assets, you know, the land banks and so on. So there's a lot of small businesses still very much family enterprises, still very new. And then when you start to look at the ornamental and the side of horticulture and the planting side of it, the landscapes, which is a bit, I guess, where I've ended up working on things like bloom, that is very, very new, very recent. Like, I know we spoke about this before, Sarah, when you start to look at, you know, how bloom came about or how other shows came about. You know, we have a very checkered history, because there were a lot of attempts at gardening shows. Like, we have, like, the Chelsea Flower Show, I think, is 120 years old now. There are garden shows like Chelsea have been around for a long time, and yet bloom is only, or would be if it was here, 14 years old this year. But and there is a reason for that, because anytime there has been an attempt in the past, preceding bloom, to get a show of that size and quality up and running, then they've lasted for a year, maybe 2 years, and they have faded away, because we weren't ready as a country, as a nation. Like, if you were to look at the sort of budgets that get spent, say, at the Chelsea Flower Show, some of those individual gardens in recent years would cost pretty much all of what we would be spending at bloom on gardens. And there's quite a pretty penny spent at bloom. So in the last few years, there could be €1 million investment to create 25, 30 gardens. It's a lot of money. I don't think we necessarily should be spending any more. But if 20 years ago, if we had tried to do that, people would have laughed and said, are you mad? Are you crazy? You can't be doing that. Or indeed, looking at an individual garden, to tell someone that it's going to cost between 50 and 100,000 euro to create a garden, they just would not believe you. Whereas now, I know from talking to garden designers and landscape architects on a reg, you've had the likes of Alan Rudden on. If Alan Rudden started to tell you about what some of his clients are paying for the gardens, I don't know. He's probably too modest to get into that kind of thing. He certainly wouldn't want to be talking about his clients and their checkbooks. But you're talking about some very, very large amounts of money. That just wouldn't have been possible or acceptable in the years past.
And then, so if we go back a few years, like, obviously an event that we would kind of know a lot about and spend a lot of time thinking about in the little museum is the Dublin Millennium of 1988. And it was even just, I remember us having a conversation and you were telling me that when we're talking about this idea that there was attempts at having garden shows and kind of events pre-bloom that didn't take off, that there was actually a garden show up in the Royal Hospital as part of the
Yes.
millennium. Like, how did that go? What was?
No, it's not that these events weren't successful. They were successful as one-offs. So that particular event was a great event. There were many others, and there were events in the RDS, Belfield. Belfield was actually the Millennial Show in 1988. I think there's probably been 4 or 5 different iterations of shows, and some of them have been very good in and of themselves. But it's like anything. It's easy to do something once and do it well, but to do it to the point where you actually create enough momentum and that you haven't worn out all of the goodwill or used up all of the funding, or you know, to actually create a business model or a format that is sustainable. That's the real trick. And I guess that's where we've been lucky with Bloom because of the timing, as you and I have just discussed. Also because at the time when I started promoting the idea of Bloom, the organization that I was then in was Board Gloss, our horticultural board, and we then merged with Board Dia. So we became part of something bigger with greater resources, and visitors to Bloom will know that Bloom is very different from the Chelsea Flower Show or Hampton Court or any of these shows, because the visitor experience is not just about plants and gardening. Yes, it's very much core to the show and central, and it is the USP, if you like, it's what makes Bloom anything else. But the wider experience is about having a fantastic day out. It's about getting to sample some of the amazing food and drink that we have in this country, and it's about doing it with your family, including the kids, which again is very different from the sort of experience that you'll have in the UK, where it's almost, and I don't want to be slagging off anyone, but it's almost aimed at the elite, the gardening elite, and it's for the snobs, and it's for, you know, we're all the people who can pronounce these names in Latin, and we're not necessarily about sharing it too much, and we're not really about making it a great experience to non-gardeners or indeed non-foodies. Whereas the view that we've taken with Bloom is to make it as accessible as possible. Yes, we want to have the highest horticultural standards. We want to have the best designers, best horticulturists, you know, amazing guys, and we do all that. We really do that well, I think, and thanks to people like Alan and others. But we want it to be accessible to everyone. We want it's not just about preaching to the converted, I suppose. It's about getting other people who will say, well, you know what, I'm not really into gardening. I don't really, or indeed, I'm not a foodie. I don't want to spend all my time, you know. But when they come to the show, they will, and they'll spend time there, and they'll have a great experience. They'll be inspired, and they'll spend lots of money at the show. And that's my job, is to help people come and, you know, invest and spend money in the sector. That's why I get paid for. And then they'll go home and they will be inspired, and they'll bring in the likes of the Allens of this world and invest in the sector, and they'll benefit. So it works, you know.
And I really want to unpack that in terms of kind of how the festival was set up in the background and so forth. But it's kind of something you touched on there when you were talking about kind of how, say, the Chelsea Flower Show is kind of received versus something like Bloom, and talking about kind of different audiences. There was a quote I came across that we're talking about garden appreciation, this idea that Ireland has access to so many shades of green in our natural landscape, and that in itself may actually have led to less of a need or less of a desire for the private gardens in an earlier time. What do you think?
I think that's a fair point. I think that's a really good point. It's a really good point. Like we are still an agrarian society. None of us are really more than 2 or 3 generations removed from the land. I'm making big generalizations here, but I think it's a fair generalization. Like, we weren't industrialized, but not urbanized to the same extent. You know, once you move outside of them, we have lots of green space. We're lucky with our parks, you know, the OBW parks and our national parks. So no, I agree that there isn't there wasn't that same requirement as other urbanized situations. So yeah, it is different, and likewise in terms of getting people to spend money on their gardens and use professional designers, because again, there wouldn't have been that view. Well, sure, anyone can take a cutting and grow a few plants and so on. and unfortunately we've had that same attitude to architecture for a long time as well, where some of the architecture in our country and the planning or lack of planning, it's just appalling. Because people didn't sit down and think, well, actually, what, if we thought about this and we used professionals, and we could actually have a much better situation. And so things have changed and moved on. But no, I think that's a very fair point. And while I'm lucky that I've got like green and blue around me here where I live in Waterford, others don't. And if you are in an urban situation or a suburban situation, and particularly in the current environment where you're not moving around very much, then the garden really, really is important. And you can go further than that. You might not have the garden. You might only have a balcony, or you might not even have the balcony. And then you're into pot plants and so on. And thankfully, all of the research and data is there to back that up now. It's not just me or someone speaking about this because I want people to spend money on plants. The science is there, the information is there. There are huge benefits from filtering your air, to dealing with noise pollution, all of those benefits. And we've become so much more aware, and thankfully we have, with the issues that we have, with the climate emergency and biodiversity loss. So it's thankfully that awareness is growing. It's not good enough to say, oh well, we've got a nice green country, we've got all those shades of green. They won't stay green that much longer if we don't look after it all.
I have a couple of comments coming in at this stage, so thank you for that, and please do keep writing in with thoughts or questions. Ava, who's joining us, is saying that she's a member of the Toronto Botanic Gardens, and the history of the Japanese maple and its move around the world has always intrigued her, and the fact that it's gone back so many centuries. And then we also have Kathy, who's just made a comment, wondering whether there's any ambitions to introduce music and dancing into Bloom.
Yeah, just on the Japanese maple, like that takes me back to your earlier question about what we can do and what we can grow here. Like we've had I think 2-3 gardens from China. We've had a number of gardens from around the world, including Chicago and other places, come to Bloom, and I'm always reminded how we can grow such a massively wide range of plants, including the maples, the Japanese maples, and of course the maple I know is very important in Canada. And in Rita now, it's obviously we've pretty much everything has lost its leaf with the kind of windy weather we've had in the last few days. But Japanese maple is a great example. And there's so many plants from Japan and China and from around the world that do really, really well in this country. So we're so lucky that we can do that. You won't see that range anywhere else. Sorry, the second point there was what? Sorry, Sarah?
Music.
Music. Yeah, absolutely. We do have a music stage at Bloom, and Lyric FM have always been very active and always come and participate at Bloom. And a lot of the individual garden designers and exhibitors will bring music to, or some form of performance to the garden, to their garden or to the show, and we always encourage that. And I think that sector, as has been, we will do more of that in the future. And again, you could be very purist about this and say, oh, it's a gardening show, it's not about music, and that's, I think, what we will always try to guard against. Without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Yeah, but that's a good call. We do it, and I hope we'll do more of it.
And I actually see my own colleague Fiona here asking, Gary, did you say that plants can help with noise pollution?
Oh yeah, massively. Yeah, like there's a reason that you see so many plants and trees planted along motorways and along roadsides. It's you've got the dust particulates that will hold to the leaves and will be watered down into the ground, so they're not moving through the air. But plants are probably one of the best things for noise abatement, as I think is the proper term. Yeah, like we forget about all these things. We forget about the role that plants play. They're more important than we are, Sarah. That's the point. We forget that.
To learn who's actually in control. And actually, something you touched on there a moment ago. You were kind of talking about how Irish kind of plants and conditions are perceived. And I kind of wonder if, from engaging with different countries and different cultures, you'd have a sense of kind of what Irish horticulture is perceived as, both either locally or internationally, and if the
Yeah,
reality.
there wouldn't be a great awareness around Irish horticulture when you move off the island. And thankfully, the awareness and the understanding of how good we are with food and drink has grown, in an exponential way in recent years, which is great, because it's an important export for us, hugely important. And we won't start talking about Brexit or anything now, but when it comes to horticulture, other than we actually we're very good at growing daffodils, actually the actual bulb and the flowers, and we do export those actually to the States, to Eastern Europe. They've gone pretty much around the world, and because we have a little bit of a window there early in the year, and particularly in certain places around Cork and that, where we can do a really good job. We also grow cut foliage for use in floristry. Again, if you can imagine, we're very good at growing grass, we're very good at growing trees because of that all that rainfall. As I said, we are the temperate rainforest, so anything like that grows really well, and we do have a reputation for growing that stuff really well, and indeed for exporting. But once you move away from that, then you move back into, say, garden plants. There's like 17-18 million euro worth of plants sold that travel to the UK most years, but it's a small amount. It's not. We don't have that sort of reputation international, that sort of knowledge. There is an awareness of our gardens, and of course many of those gardens are associated with great houses and castles, and that awareness is there. And sometimes actually I get a little bit upset about that, because there's almost a greater awareness among the tourists who are coming in than we actually have. So there's times when, like I said, I mentioned about Congreve earlier, which is local to me here, but we have fantastic gardens around the country, fantastic plant collections, and they don't get visited enough, I would suggest. We could certainly make more of them, and we have great horticulturists, huge, incredible knowledge, inspirational people who I'm just, I'm embarrassed sometimes when I listen to them, the knowledge that they have. They know so much, and I think we could. And maybe that's something that will come of COVID, where we will maybe there will be less inclination to scatter and to leave the country, and that people will stay here and will visit these places and be inspired from them and take some of those ideas home.
Yeah, exactly. I've always been a big fan of staycationing in Ireland, but I guess, yeah, it's something we've really all had spent an awful lot of time talking and thinking about this year. And I think obviously, just to kind of, I guess, come back to, we've spoken about bloom a few times so far this evening, but kind of from a curatorial point of view, could you take us back to, like, right back to the beginning, when the idea to set it up came about originally? Like, obviously there would have been commercial ambitions behind it, but kind of, what were the soft ambitions? What was the hope for the festival? What were you inspired and hoping to?
There were lots of ideas and lots of ambitions. I guess how it started was, I had the opportunity, before I ever started to work with Bord Gáis and Bord Bia in a sort of an industry development role. I had the opportunity to be involved in designing and building gardens at different shows, or arranging sponsorship and so on. So I was fairly familiar with shows, and visiting, again, Chelsea Flower Show and Hampton Court and Patton Park Show for going back for, I don't know, maybe 30 years now, and certainly 25. So I was aware of how powerful a show can be in terms of recruitment, if you like, in terms of getting people excited and engaged in gardening, getting them interested in plants. I've had, I guess, so much experience over the years, whether it's working with, say, the Super Garden TV series or things like that. And I know I have a good idea of what really works. And I think we all know it's when you engage all your senses, and if you really want to engage people's senses, particularly the olfactory senses and tasting and hearing, you need to hear plants move and rustle, and you need to hear water, and you need to put your hand in the water. There's that tactile piece. There is no better way of really getting people excited about plants and gardens other than bringing them into a garden. And those kind of fantastic high-end gardens that the Alan Ruddens of this world design, most of us don't get to see them. and Alan doesn't get to share them, with the rest of us. It's a private, operation. So that's where the idea came from. And I had tried to work with some other show organizers who were doing their very best. But it became very clear to me that you needed an organization like Board Beer to get behind it, to underwrite it, that it would take many years to make it stack up financially. And you needed someone who had a real long-term commitment and interest in horticulture, because it's not just about, let's just go into events and we'll make money with a show. And it doesn't work like that. It doesn't stack up in that way. It doesn't make any income from Board Beer. Board Beer makes a significant investment in there every year, but it's a very good investment, because lots of other people will row in. The exhibitors, the designers, the sponsors will all come in and use it. And it makes it into a much bigger, better event with more visitors, more media coverage, and then more impact afterwards, where more people, as I said, have engaged in gardening and are spending money in the category. So we started off probably certainly with a smaller ambition to have sort of, maybe 10, 15 gardens with a little bit of a food area. The location was always going to be key. I had visited lots of shows, particularly around Europe, some further afield, and it was very obvious to me that you need the backdrop. So you couldn't run Bloom in the RDS, you couldn't run it in Goffs. The backdrop, and you'll know this from your work, is just so important. You have to provide the right context. And we're blessed with the Phoenix Park, and we're blessed with Visitor Centre, because you have, a green palette, if you like. You've got the trees, you've got a certain amount of ornamentation there that gives you, something to start with. You've got the wall, listened to me and agreed, okay, we'll do this, we'll get involved. And then, of course, it took off from there, because there was a recognition, well, you know what, this is not just good for gardening. We can show all our best food and drink, and we can do a lot more with the show. So, but that's all down to individuals, entrepreneurial people, and people who saw the opportunity and wanted to get on board, and indeed great sponsors. People like Santa Rita, who said, well, you know what, this is a place that he wants to be. There's a kind of almost like a halo effect, I think, because we know there's so much passion and energy there, so much creativity, so much good stuff, whether it's the food, the drink, the horticulture, the craft. There's a lot of really good, strong Irish content that we can all be proud of, and we celebrate it at Bloom, and everybody wants to celebrate. I think everyone needs to do that sort of thing and be part of that, and as I said, you've got the great backdrop, and if you get some good weather over those 5 days, it's a fun day out.
Yeah, Bloom on a sunny day is absolutely glorious as an experience. And I think when you're talking about backdrop, I immediately know what you mean, and I agree, because I would always feel like in the little museum art building is, in my opinion, one of the single greatest artifacts that we could ever get access to.
Part of the experience,
instrumental, absolutely. And like when we're talking about the experience, like in the museum, one thing that we find is if the children are having fun, mum and dad can kind of take a breath out and enjoy themselves as well. And like I know that's something that, or is that something that kind of a conscious effort goes into in Bloom? Because obviously, as we began this conversation, horticulture is long Latin words. It's a kind of a very specific language. It can be quite intimidating. Like, how do you engage a younger audience?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Sarah. We made a conscious decision from the very beginning. If we were just focused, if we had a very commercial focus, and how do we get the maximum number of people paying the maximum amount of whatever ticket price and so on, we would have taken a different view. Or indeed, if we were a purist horticultural society, it might have taken a different form. But we're none of those. And there was a recognition that our young people are the gardeners, and indeed the foodies of the future. That recognition, plus the fact that I think that culturally we're a little bit different as well. Nobody bats an eyelid that you can't bring young children into Chelsea Flower Show. It's just accepted. I'd have people screaming at the gate and looking for the chief executive of Board Beer, to find out what's going on. We're just different in that way, I think, and that's fine. So like I think most years we have between 15 and 20,000 children at the show every year. On Thursday and Friday, we have groups coming in tours from schools, which is great. It's more organized. But we have about 15, 20,000 kids coming with their families. We don't charge in for children. And we try to make sure we have content there that's of particular interest to them, that they can engage with and have fun and run around and be a little bit more relaxed than you can be looking at, show gardens and so on. So we've made a conscious effort to do it. And I think it's one of the best things that we do. Very few people, a handful of people will say to me, "Oh, Gary, I wish I didn't have to bring my kids here. Could you not ban them and let it all be a very grown-up affair?" But it's few and far between, I think. And if you don't want to have anything to do with kids, or if you're not in that sort of frame of mind, you don't have to. There's plenty of space there. And again, that's thanks to the OBW providing all that. It was a good move. I think it's an investment in the future, which is good.
And so obviously you're based in Phoenix Park, and you've got quite a famous neighbour for bloom in our president. And my understanding is that the president is one of the first guests to visit the gardens each year. Is that?
Yeah, he has been our patron, as was Mary McAleese, from the get-go, which is really important, actually. Sometimes I think he gets a bit of stick sometimes, but he brings an energy and enthusiasm with him, and particularly when it comes to the exhibitors, the garden designers, the builders, the people who have put in weeks and weeks of hard work and lots of money, really work very hard. And sometimes those plans and preparations and work can go across a year or 2 years before they're actually there in a finished, fully realized garden at the show. And I love the fact that gets recognized, in the best way possible, or at the highest level possible by our president. And people do appreciate that he will stop and look and chat. I think it's hugely important. I get a little bit embarrassed sometimes because he could be at the ploughing championship or something else, and he still talked about bloom, which is great. I'm sure their organizers get a bit annoyed, but it's great for us. And I don't know, Sarah, if you've ever heard his speech at bloom, but my God, it's incredible.
He's an amazing orator. He very much is. I think that's.
No, he really is inspirational, and that is what bloom is all about. It's all about inspiration. It's about giving people ideas, showing them what you can do, pushing the boat out a little bit. Certainly when it comes to garden design. And he brings so much energy and support to it. It's fantastic, and he has a serious interest. They both have a serious interest, and not just doing their duties. And she will try to sneak back in over the weekend if she can. And we've often gone in and looked at their garden as well. And sometimes if there are some particular plants that really take their fancy, we'll see can we get those put into the garden at the hours as well, much to the annoyance of the OPW gardeners.
That's a lovely. That's gorgeous. It's very human about that. And kind of, in saying that there is, that there is 12 months of blood, sweat and tears that go into producing a garden and go into producing a festival like this, and that it is nice to see someone like our president take the time to acknowledge the people who make it happen. It's kind of much like curating exhibitions, something like curating a bloom festival and program. It doesn't, or it can't happen overnight. What does the 12 months prior look like?
Yeah, well, in normal times, I guess. It's a good question, because people do sometimes think, this is, something they created the day before or the week before, the show opens, and you can't do that with any level of money or investment. It's just not possible, particularly when you're dealing with plants and horticulture and you're doing things outside. You have to look at the seasons, at what's growing, and and there's a long lead time. And particularly for some of those bigger gardens and installations, they're very, very complex with a lot of different materials and skills required to take a lot of the coordination and financial backing. So we never stop working on Bloom. Obviously, it's a little bit different at the moment, but in a normal year, at the show, I would be, or me and some of the team at least, will be talking to at least 5 or 10 exhibitors, sponsors, garden designers, who we will be expecting to be there the following year. And sometimes you're looking at a 2-year lead in where, again, it could be a sponsor, or it could be a garden designer who we really want to see at Bloom, and it's going to be 2 or 3 years before they can actually physically get there and make it happen. But so it never stops, I guess. Without getting into too much boring detail, in terms of the actual work then on site. So all year there's a small team of us working with sponsors and working with the horticultural industry, looking at the logistics, the physical side of the show, the health and safety, all of that sort of thing. And then we're on site then for about 4.5 weeks before the show. And you're basically building a small town or a village, because while it's a beautiful context and backdrop, there's nothing there really by way of infrastructure. So you're into fencing, trackway, roadways, bridges, putting bridges across streams and haws. We're doing all sorts of things before you even then start to build stands and gardens. And the gardens are quite amazing to watch. And sometimes we capture it on time-lapse cameras. You just see, you could have 25, 30 gardens under construction at the same time, with any number of people working on each garden. And that's a huge amount of energy over 3 weeks. And then we're into, the cleanup, the presentation, the media day, the VIP stuff, the president, as you said. Obviously, it's really important that we get him there to open up first thing on the Thursday morning. And then you're into 5 days of the show, which can be really intense. And then for the team, because it's you've got the hours that are open to the public, but as you know, Sarah, the preparation and the planning and all the stuff that goes on before that, and then it happens at evening time. And there's a lot of dinners and lunches and a lot of conversations and planning happens during the show, as well as monitoring everyone's experience, the traffic, liaising with the guards and so on. Then you get through the show, then you close it down, and then you've got, I think we have 2 weeks then, 2.5 weeks, I think, to clean it up and to give the park back to the OPW the way we got it. And that's really important, because it is one of our national parks. It's a really important piece of real estate that has to be looked after and protected. So yeah, it seems like it never stops on a normal year.
And it's a huge amount of responsibility in terms of kind of being given such a valuable real estate to use. And like one thing that there's always a lot of excitement around is the judging of the gardens in terms of identifying who's won the various different awards. Now, do the judging parameters, do they change as the years go on, or is this kind of a fixed thing in kind of garden culture?
Yeah, it's fairly fixed, and it's fairly fixed because a lot of garden show managers around the world, and particularly across the water, and everybody is kind of watching what everyone else is doing. Everyone's looking at design trends. Everyone's looking to see what are landscape architects and garden designers talking about, and what are they trying to realize at a show. So there's always kind of slight changes and adjustments, but typically they stay very similar, and there might be different terminology or a different number of marks given to different categories if you look from show to show or from year to year, but they are pretty much the same, and for good reason. Because again, if you're sort of a hardcore horticulturist, you're going to be, and particularly in the garden design space, you're going to be very aware of what's important. Like, number one, starting with the design brief and meeting that brief. So there's a design intention that the designer has to explain very clearly in writing and verbally to the judges, and then he or she then has to meet that and show how they've met it. On the horticultural side, so our panel, an amazing bunch of people. So the likes of, say, Paul, the curator from the National Botanic Gardens, has been on our panel since the get-go. We have a couple of guys from London who are phenomenally successful. Paul, the likes of Andrew Wilson, who has written, I think, 25, 30 books now at this point. One of the top garden designers in the UK, who won the RHS award as the the garden designer of the century, actually, there recently. Incredibly talented people. So they're looking at different things. So I mentioned the brief. When it comes to horticulture, then Paul and the guys will look at everything in terms of plants association, plant quality, all of those things that serious gardeners look at. So you don't put Mediterranean sun-loving type plants in a bog garden and vice versa and so on. And they look at construction, they look at standards, they look at finish. Like, it's very, very objective, and it's not subjective in any way, which you might find surprising, because amateur gardeners look at the garden and they go, wow, I love that. That's, I want that, or not. And it is very subjective. And those views that most people have around gardening are formed on experiences that they might have had as a child, or gardens that they've seen, or it's very different from how the judges look at a garden and pull it apart. We've got it right, I think, and again, I hats off to that team of people who do it, and to do it year after year, with very little rancor or controversy, because those medals are massively important. If you put all that energy and your reputation into a garden, and your reputation on the line in such a high profile show, with the view, the 120,000 visitors and the TV cameras, and if you get it wrong, you really are, crashing and burning in front of a very big audience. So it's a very interesting area. And I know garden designers who would never do it. Some friends of mine who I would have studied with back in the day, who are very successful, but they would not do it for love nor money.
I guess
it's quite something.
You do have to make yourself very vulnerable and very open, actually, when you put it like that. And
yeah,
like, obviously the Bloom didn't go ahead this year for obvious enough reasons. But I wonder, is it, because you've already explained that obviously a festival like this doesn't happen overnight, you must be at this stage thinking about what the future of Bloom looks like. Do we have any ideas at this stage?
Oh, we've lots of ideas, Sarah. We have lots of ideas. My organisation, Boardbia, wants something to happen. Is very much behind it. When you talk to exhibitors, sponsors, everyone wants something to happen. And Bloom, I guess, is no different from any other walk of life or thing that we do. There is an optimism and enthusiasm to do something. One of the lessons we learned this year when we did the Bloom at Home campaign, which was great and really well received, was that you need content. And again, this is your area, Sarah. You really need good content. All of the bells and whistles and marketing and PR spin is great, but you really need to have something that's worth taking people's time to share with. So that was the lesson from this year. So we're determined, subject to wherever we end up in terms of the Living with COVID plan, we are determined to make something happen. We really hope that the COVID trajectory is going our way, and that we can have a physical show. It won't be the same. There's no way we're going to be back to where we were in 2019, but we really are hoping that we can have a physical show, and that people can come, smaller numbers. All of the, you can imagine the restrictions and the controls and so on, but we have a beautiful big open green space, and there's no reason why we couldn't pivot, to use that word that we're all sick of hearing these days. There's no reason why we couldn't pivot and take all of the stuff that's under these big marquees and take it outside. Create more space around the garden. There's all sorts of things that we could do. And as we said earlier, the backdrop is so amazing and the wall garden is there. You could create a really fantastic experience and a really good day out that would be really safe, I think. And there is a will to do that, and certainly we're up for it. So that's our hope. And if worst case scenario, it's just not safe and it can't be done, if we can create some content that we can share in the way that we're sharing this conversation, and we can work with RTE and use the social media platform, that's what we do. Because people want ideas and inspiration, and they want to be entertained. God, we need it so badly these days. So we're going to do whatever we can, Sarah.
Great. Well, that's exciting and kind of optimism inducing to hear. And one thing that I must thank you for, I the dreaded C word. I have started thinking about planning some shopping myself in the last couple of days, and I've noticed on your website you've got an amazing amount of resource in terms of giving us access to a large number of suppliers and kind of people across the island who are actually producing amazing kind of, I guess, kind of souvenirs, food, and various different selections that we can all be shopping from. So I know that list is going to be particularly useful to myself, and I thank you for that. So somehow we've come to the hour, and Gary, it's been really lovely chatting to you this evening. It's been really fascinating to hear about your own journey and your own background, but also the effort and kind of the reality of what's gone into making Bloom the success that it is. And I genuinely look forward to the day that I can run into you somewhere in the middle of Phoenix Park when halfway through a visit with plant pots under my arm. So until that day, thank you so much.
Me too, Sarah.
And thank you so much. And we will see everyone again next week. So to those of you that have been with us here this evening, thank you so much for joining another week of 120 Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. But for now, Gary, thank you so much, and good evening, everyone.
Take care.